July 2016 was a particularly harsh July in New Zealand. Mount Aspiring National Park, spread over 355,000 hectares, was greeted by a thick layer of snow. In the heart of the park, amidst sheer cliffs and ancient glaciers, lies the famous Routeburn Track, one of the country's 9 great hiking trails. In summer, this 32-kilometer trail attracts thousands of hikers from all over the world. They come here to see the majestic mountain valleys, crystal-clear lakes, and snow-capped peaks of the Southern Alps. But with the onset of winter, the Routeburn Trek changes dramatically. Climbing to an altitude of 1,300 meters above sea level, the route becomes a serious challenge, even for experienced climbers. In winter, there is a special atmosphere of danger. Sudden snowstorms can strike in a matter of minutes, turning a clear day into a whiteout. Avalanches regularly come down the slopes, burying everything in their path. Temperatures often drop to minus 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, and strong winds increase the feeling of cold, making it almost unbearable. The New Zealand Department of Conservation strongly advises tourists to refrain from traveling the route at this time of year, but not everyone heeds these warnings. In February 2016, a young couple from the Czech Republic arrived in New Zealand in search of adventure. Pavlina Pijova, 33, and Andrei Peter, 27, had obtained tourist visas and were full of ambitious plans. Like many other travelers, they decided to start by earning money from local farms to save up for traveling around the country. The small town of Motueka became their first home in this faraway land. Here on the apple plantations, they spent long days harvesting the crops. The work was hard, their hands ached from the endless plucking of fruit, but the dream was worth it. Every dollar earned brought them closer to their main goal of exploring the wildlife of the South Island. Each of them had their own plans for the future. Andre, an experienced snowboard instructor, hoped to find work on the ski slopes of Queenstown, a popular tourist town in the South Island. Pavlina, on the other hand, hoped to get a job in one of the local restaurants or mountain hotels. They believed they could combine work with traveling, discovering new trails, and the beauty of this amazing country. When their job search in Queenstown failed, the couple began looking for other ways to spend their time. For several months, they explored the city's neighborhoods, taking small hikes on local trails. Gradually, their attention was drawn to the Routeburn Track, one of New Zealand's most scenic hiking trails, known for its mountain lakes and majestic passes. This decision, made almost by accident, changed their lives forever. On the morning of July 25th, they walked into the Department of Conservation office in Queenstown. It's worth noting that this time of year falls in the middle of winter in New Zealand. The local ranger, upon learning of their plans, immediately sounded the alarm. He persistently tried to explain to them the dangers of the route in winter. The ranger detailed the frequent snowstorms, the risk of avalanches, and the fact that many sections of the trail were completely hidden under a thick layer of snow. He especially emphasized that the weather forecast for the coming days portends a strong deterioration in conditions. But Pavlina and Andre, accustomed to European mountain routes, were confident that they could cope. Their preparation for the trek proved woefully inadequate for winter conditions. Their backpacks did not contain the essentials: no ice crampons, no ice axes, not even a tent, only sleeping bags and the hope of reaching mountain shelters along the route. Nor did they take an emergency beacon, a device that could signal rescuers in case of trouble. In addition, they left no information about their route with anyone, another fatal mistake. On the evening of July 25th, Pavlina and Andre parked their camper at the start of the trek. They spent the last quiet night there, making plans for the upcoming trek, and not suspecting that the New Zealand mountains were preparing them for a terrible ordeal. In the early morning hours of July 26th, Pavlina and Andre set foot on the Routeburn Trail. The day started out relatively calm. The sky was clear and the air was fresh and invigorating. The first kilometers of the trail did not portend trouble. The trail, though covered in snow, was clearly visible, and the pair made steady progress. In 4 hours, they reached their first stopping point, the Falls Hut. This small wooden shelter, nestled in a picturesque valley, was their shelter for the first night. They were the only guests of the hut, a fact that should have alerted experienced travelers. In winter, empty huts on popular trails are a sure sign that locals are avoiding the trail for a reason. The next morning, around 10 o'clock, they continued on their way heading for Harris Pass. The weather forecast promised worsening conditions, but the air seemed stable enough to continue on the trail. Within an hour, however, the weather began to change. Heavy gray clouds covered the sky, a piercing wind picked up, and then snow began to fall. Visibility gradually deteriorated, and what should have been an hour-long trek stretched into 5 grueling hours. With each step, it became more and more difficult to walk. The snow was already up to my knees, and the trail was gradually disappearing under the freshly fallen cover. When they reached Harris Pass, they saw a sign telling them that it would be another 3 hours before they reached Mackenzie's cabin. Deciding that the most difficult part of the route was behind them, they moved on. It was a fatal mistake. Shortly after they left the pass, the weather changed dramatically. The snowfall intensified, visibility dropped rapidly, and their tracks were covered almost instantly. By 5 p.m., it began to darken rapidly. The wind increased to gale force. Its gusts were so powerful that one had to bend low to keep one's balance. A thick fog engulfed everything around them like a white veil, turning the familiar world into an unrecognizable labyrinth. Pavlina and Andre switched on their headlamps, but their light barely penetrated the dense snow veil even a meter away. The trail markers that usually showed the way had completely disappeared under the snow. In complete disorientation, they began circling the slope. Each next step seemed similar to the previous one, and time seemed to stop in this white chaos. They tried to use a compass, but with zero visibility and total loss of bearings, even it couldn't help them. Exhausted and lost, they made the only possible decision: to seek shelter for the night. After much searching, the only suitable place turned out to be a sheer cliff under which they could take some shelter from the merciless wind. This night was a real test of their endurance. Without a tent, with only a thin awning to protect them from the elements, they tried to keep warm by huddling together. The snow was constantly seeping under their makeshift shelter, their clothes gradually getting wet, making the cold even more penetrating. Peacock kept her eyes open all night, fearing that they might be covered in snow if she allowed herself to fall asleep. Every gust of wind threatened to tear away their flimsy shelter, and the temperature continued to drop. At dawn, the sky cleared a little, and they saw the cruel irony of their situation. Mackenzie's cabin was not far away at all, behind the snowy ridges that yesterday's bad weather had hidden. In the morning light, it seemed so close and accessible. Gathering the last of their strength and encouraged by the proximity of a saving shelter, they immediately set out, imagining that they would soon be warm and safe. But the mountains prepared for them the last, most terrible test. The marked trail to Lake Mackenzie was steep and completely covered in snow. To save time, they decided to go straight ahead, a decision driven by fatigue and a desperate desire to get to the cabin. But instead of descending to the hut, they began to climb up the valley, heading farther and farther up an unknown mountain spur. By noon, the sky was again overcast and the biting wind had increased. The search for the right path took several hours. Soon, the first signs that something was wrong with Andre began to appear. His movements became sluggish. His speech began to slur. Despite the cold, he suddenly pulled off his wet pants, which, he said, had become too heavy. Pavlina saw the colors fade from his face, but he continued to insist that he was fine. It was a classic manifestation of hypothermia, a condition where hypothermia begins to affect brain function. The day was drawing toward evening when they stopped at a large overhanging rock to catch their breath. Pavlina went ahead to scout, trying to find any sign of a trail. Andre stayed by the rock, promising to catch up with her soon. When she returned, she found him in a strange state. He had taken off his down jacket, muttering something inarticulate about "it's ruined." His face was unnaturally ruddy despite the frost. It was another ominous sign of severe hypothermia. Dusk was thickening unusually fast due to the dense cloud cover. They tried to walk on. Now Pavlina was leading and Andrei was slowly following her. Suddenly she turned around at the sound and saw that he had stopped, staring blankly at the ground. His eyes were glassy and his speech, when he tried to say something, became completely unintelligible. At that moment, the snow beneath them suddenly failed, and they both collapsed into darkness. Peacock lost her headlamp and glove in the fall, leaving her in total darkness. The slope was steep, about 45 degrees, and they flew almost 20 meters down before they stopped. With trembling legs, she began to descend lower, trying to find Andrei. In the pitch darkness, she had to explore every inch of the slope practically by feel. Soon she found him. He was wedged between huge boulders and fallen tree trunks, and the heavy backpack on his back only made it worse, pushing him deeper into the crevice. His breathing became more and more shallow, each breath coming with difficulty. The temperature at this point had dropped to -12 degrees, and the gusts of wind were adding to the cold. Pavlina desperately tried to pull Andrei out, but any attempt to move him threatened further down the slope. They were on a narrow ledge, and in the darkness it was impossible to determine the depth of the cliff below. Gradually, Andrei's breathing became less and less, until it stopped altogether. In desperation, she found his backpack and took out a spare flashlight, but it was too late. Andrei showed no signs of life. The next 2 nights were the most terrifying of Pavlina's life. She found herself alone in the mountains next to the body of the man with whom she had made plans for the future only a few days before. Sheltering from the biting wind behind the same rocks that had taken Andrei's life, she fought not only the cold, but also the mounting despair. She only had a few granola bars and a half-empty thermos of water left, too little to sustain her strength for long. The temperature continued to drop, reaching -15 degrees at night, and her soaked clothes were turning into an icy shell. Despite her heartache and physical exhaustion, she forced herself to move, to exercise to keep warm, but her strength melted away with each passing hour. On those endless nights, her only companions were the howling of the wind and agonizing thoughts of whether there was anything she could have done differently. On the 3rd day, realizing that there was nowhere to wait for help, she made the hardest decision of her life: to leave Andrei's body and try to save herself. After gathering the last remnants of food and melting some snow for water, she began her lonely journey through snowdrifts and rocky scree. Her boots were soaked through, and without gloves, her hands were quickly becoming desensitized. Every few minutes she had to stop and knead her fingers to avoid severe frostbite. A thick fog shrouded the mountains. Visibility was less than 10 meters, making navigation nearly impossible. She walked, often falling waist-deep in snow. Each step was given with incredible difficulty. As night fell, Pavlina found shelter under an overhanging rock, where she was almost completely covered with fresh snow while she slept. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees, and by morning her hands and feet were so numb she could barely move her fingers. But she knew that if she stayed where she was, it would mean certain death. By noon, Peacock could see the faint outline of Mackenzie's cabin in the valley below. Gathering her last strength, she began to descend toward the lake. Massive boulders surrounded the lake on all sides, forming the only possible path to the cabin, and every step through this labyrinth of rock could be her last. With exhaustion, she stumbled and fell into the icy water, but the proximity of the shelter gave her the strength to get out and reach her destination. The hut was empty and frozen. No one had been here for a long time, but inside the hut, Pavlina found the most necessary things for survival: supplies of canned food, dry food, and a gas stove with the remnants of fuel. Like most highland huts in New Zealand, there was no telephone or radio communication. She realized that her disappearance might not even be suspected. After all, she and Andrei had left no information about their route with anyone. For the next 30 days, this hut became her only refuge. Pavlina developed a strict rationing system. Each meal was carefully measured to stretch her supplies as far as possible. She established a rigid daily routine for herself, realizing that the regimen would help her keep her sanity in complete solitude. The morning began with a check of the weather and the condition of the snow around the hut, followed by stretching and exercise as far as the condition of her frostbitten limbs allowed. Avalanches could often be seen outside the windows. Nature reminded us that it would be impossible to get out on our own. Especially dangerous were the days after snowfalls, when freshly fallen snow created additional load on the slopes. Pavlina kept a record of the weather conditions in a notebook she had found. This information could be useful for planning a possible rescue. Using ash from the fire, she wrote a huge H in the snow, the international signal for help for passing helicopters. Every day she maintained this sign, keeping the snow from covering it. Several times she heard the sound of helicopter engines and desperately waved anything that could attract attention. Jackets, scarves, even tried to use the sun's reflection off metal objects. But the helicopters flew past without noticing her signals in the snowy desert. In an effort to stay fit and fight despair, she forced herself to exercise every day. Despite her frostbite, Pavlina performed exercises with her backpack outside the hut, preparing herself for a possible solo descent from the mountains. She realized that if help did not come, she would have to find a way to escape on her own. The nights were the most difficult. In the darkness, her thoughts inevitably returned to Andrei, to that fateful day, and to all the decisions that had led them to this route. Sleep came with difficulty, interrupted by the sounds of the mountain weather and the cold that seemed impossible to escape even in the hut. On August 26, 2016, the silence of the mountains was broken by the sound of an approaching helicopter. Peacock, already used to disappointment, still ran out of the hut wearing a brightly colored life jacket. The New Zealand Rescue Service helicopter was circling over Lake Mackenzie. By this point, the families of Peacock and Andrei had already endured weeks of a real nightmare. First, the occasional Facebook messages were replaced by complete silence. Then the phone calls stopped going through. Alarmed parents tried to contact hostels and hotels in Queenstown, but no one saw the young Czech couple. In desperation, they began writing en masse to the Czech consulate in New Zealand. Vladka Kennett, the Czech consul, who lives in Glenorchy near Queenstown, was literally inundated with messages from concerned relatives from Europe. She immediately contacted the New Zealand Department of Conservation, giving them all available information about the missing hikers. When it turned out that Pavlina and Andrei were planning to walk the Routeburn Track, the local police organized a check of the parking lots near the start of the route. That's where their camper was found, which had been sitting unmoved for almost a month. Rescuers methodically surveyed the route by helicopter until they spotted a lone figure desperately waving his arms near Mackenzie's hut. After 3 attempts to land in difficult weather conditions, the helicopter finally managed to land on a small area near the hut. What the rescuers saw stunned even seasoned professionals. Despite her exhaustion, Pavlina was still lucid. Her fingers were severely frostbitten, but she continued to maintain order in the hut and keep a record of her survival. Rescuers noted her remarkable organization. All remaining supplies were neatly sorted and paths around the hut were cleared. The evacuation took place in difficult conditions. Gusty winds made it difficult for the helicopter to take off. Peacock was immediately transported to Queenstown Hospital, where a medical team was already waiting for her arrival. The medics were amazed. Despite severe frostbite on her fingers and toes, Peacock's overall condition remained stable. Medics called her survival in such extreme conditions a true miracle. 2 days later, on August 28th, rescuers found Andrei's body. It was on a steep slope, about 2 kilometers from the hut, wedged between rocks and fallen trees. The difficult terrain and incessant snowfall made evacuating the body a particularly difficult task. It took rescuers several hours and special climbing equipment to reach him. Shortly after the rescue, Pavlina Pijova held a short press conference. She openly admitted all the mistakes she and Andrei had made, not having the necessary equipment, ignoring weather warnings, and, most importantly, deciding not to leave information about their route to anyone. This case was a watershed for safety on New Zealand's mountain routes. The Department of Conservation strengthened control over winter hiking and tightened the requirements for hikers' equipment in the cold season. Now everyone planning a winter hike on difficult routes is required to carry an emergency beacon and leave a detailed plan of their route. In a letter of thanks to the Department of Conservation, Pavlina wrote, "The well-equipped hut literally saved my life. Nothing can express my gratitude for the infrastructure you have created." She sent a separate message to the rescuers thanking them for their tremendous efforts to rescue and return Andrei to his family. Pavlina and Andrei's story was a stark reminder that mountains do not forgive frivolity. Even the most scenic route can turn into a death trap if you approach its preparation irresponsibly. There is no room for chance in the mountains. Every detail, from the right equipment to informing loved ones of your plans, can be decisive in the fight for life. Today, the Routeburn Track remains one of New Zealand's most popular routes. Thousands of hikers traverse the trail every year, enjoying the magnificent views. But now, at pre-hike briefings, rangers often tell the story of two Czech hikers, as a reminder that even the most beautiful place can carry deadly dangers. This story makes you think about the fine line between thirst for adventure and recklessness. What pushes people to ignore obvious warnings of danger? Perhaps it's self-belief, or maybe it's simple carelessness, or a desire to defy the elements? What would you do if you were Pavlina after Andrei's death? Would you have stayed by the body of your loved one, or would you have immediately started fighting for your own survival? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, give it a like. It will help more people learn about the importance of responsible mountain hiking. Subscribe to the channel. There are many more exciting stories about survival in extreme conditions ahead. In the meantime, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and don't forget that any adventure should be carefully prepared. See you in the next issues.